Marco Rubio, Republican Senator from Florida, Vice Chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee and member of the Foreign Relations Committee. Good to have you in focus today.
Thank you. Thanks, Harris.
Let's start with what critics are saying about the president not doing the most that it could, short of getting us into World War III, for Ukraine. And the response not only from you, but any sort of shift that you might be seeing among Democrats on the Hill.
Well, I think throughout this crisis, you've seen Congress is actually, in a bipartisan way, Congress has been dragging the president to lead on it. They didn't want to do the oil embargo. They didn't want to do the oil cutoff. It's Congress that pushed them to do that. It's Congress that's been pushing to provide more weaponry. And I think it's important to understand that we're going to have to continue to do that. I think the White House has been a little bit a step behind on each of these. And more importantly, this is an evolving conflict. The Russian tactics are now changing. You know, where this was initially an effort to get rid of the government, install a puppet government. Now it's increasingly becoming lay siege to at least 6 or 7 cities, capture 2 or 3 of them, and strengthen their negotiating hand and their battlefield advantage. So then they can go to Ukraine and say, all right, we're ready for a ceasefire now, but you got to give us all this land. You got to impose neutrality in your constitution. You have to dismantle your military, and you've got to install some pro-Russian puppets in your government. But he needs the battlefield advantage to get to that point. So as we see the adjustment in their tactics in the battlefield, that's going to change the weapons and the systems that they're going to use, that they're going to need to defend against that.
That is so comprehensive, what you just said about, you know, what Russia would want. Technically, they want Ukraine to just acknowledge that they can live, but that Russia has to get everything that it wants. I'm curious, what is your response when you hear, and I know it's across chamber, but in the House, you hear Hakeem Jeffries, Congressman Jeffries, say, don't take no-fly zone off the table, when many Democrats, particularly those on the far left, say, no, that pitches us straight into World War III. We're not doing that. Like, how surprising is it that he would step out like that?
Look, members of Congress, like the general public, are watching these horrifying images of human suffering, and it's going to get worse, by the way, because the Russians don't have an unlimited supply of precision-guided munitions. So at some point, they're just lobbing stuff over, and it hits what it hits. So it's going to get worse. People are responding to that, and they want to do something. And a no-fly zone is something that a lot of people talk about and support, because they feel like that's something we'd like to see done. I'd like to see that achieved. The problem is that I don't think if people fully understand what it entails. It entails knocking out surface-to-air missile sites inside of Russia. We have to go into Russia and knock those out. And it does involve a massive escalation. And in the end, it's not necessarily going to solve the problem that Ukraine now faces with a significant number of mortar and artillery mass firing, which is what they're now doing. No-fly zone can't really restrict that unless you're going to knock out the artillery batteries as well. And you have to also knock out they're launching missiles and rockets from Russian territory. So if you really want to have a protect against that, you'd have to go into Russia and knock those out as well. I do think there are things we can do to help Ukraine. The surface-to-air missile systems that they're asking for, that hopefully are going to be provided, are systems that they know how to operate, and that would make it harder for Russia to operate in the airspace, especially with long-range strategic bombers.
You've given us a lot to think about. I mean, one of the things that we've talked about on this program is a no-fly zone would entail hitting Russian planes over Ukraine, but what you say is so much more critical in the long term, and that is that you'd have to hit targets inside Russia. Senator, thank you for that. That is interesting. You know, the White House press secretary yesterday really struggled to defend President Biden's decision to give Ukraine $800 million in aid on top of what it's already given, while also withholding the MiG-29s that it's begging for. Let's watch together.
I think you just said that you didn't want to have NATO pilots bringing down Russian planes. But under the administration's policy of moving out this long-range anti-aircraft, it's okay to have NATO equipment bringing down Russian planes as long as it's launched by a Ukrainian.
I would note that the equipment that we've provided is defensive, as you know, not offensive, and we see that as being a difference.
Because the planes can be used for an offensive purpose and the anti-missile systems cannot.
Correct.
All right, real quickly, here's a list of the weapons being sent to Ukraine: Stingers, aircraft, anti-aircraft systems, Javelin, anti-tank missiles, and Switchblade drones. And we're already seeing some of that equipment arriving in Poland today. Senator Rubio, your response.
Well, I think the issue about the MiGs is the way it was handled, I think, was inappropriate. What I think stunned a lot of people was that 48 hours earlier, the Secretary of State was saying he was for it, and then suddenly we were not for it. At the end of the day, I think there's a legitimate debate about how useful they would be, but if that's what Ukraine wants and we're trying to help them, we should try to facilitate that, not look to automatically dismiss it in a way that sort of created this confusion now that might be misread by the Russians as weakness on our part in terms of being supportive of Ukraine. And so I just think it was handled very poorly. Obviously, aircraft can be used for defensive purposes. Look, anytime a country invades you, everything you do is defensive. We're not talking about equipping Ukraine to invade Russia. We're talking about equipping them to defend their own country. The Russians are the invaders here.
Anything that a country invades you, anything that you would do to fire back, that is all defensive. Absolutely true. What is your take on labeling now publicly the President Biden saying about Putin, he's definitely a war criminal, or in Biden's opinion, he said he's a war criminal. Is it personal, or does that do something greater?
Well, I think it states the obvious. I mean, it's hard. I think at some point you have to be clear with people and not play games about how you feel about the situation. War crimes are being committed. The deliberate targeting of civilians in war. You know, I'm going to hit a hospital. I'm going to hit a shelter where people are hiding from the bombs. I'm going to deliberately target that. That is a war crime, and the person ordering those strikes is a war criminal. And that's Vladimir Putin. He's the commander-in-chief of the Russian armed forces who are carrying out these targeted attacks against civilians in civilian locations. So there's no other way to describe them. I mean, it's just a matter of fact. And again, another example, the president being dragged to that position yesterday. It didn't even look planned, frankly. It looked like something he said on the fly, moving through a scrum at the White House. And then, of course, his people have to run and clean it up. But I just think it states the obvious, what everybody already sees with their own eyes.
You know, I do think it's worth pointing out after you said that, he gave two different answers. He first said, no, he's not a war criminal. And then he doubled back and said, wait, did you ask me if he's a war criminal? Well, I do believe that he is. I mean, it's interesting that you point out that there would be a cleanup. I would imagine cleanup would include, well, what did he mean? Because he said both. I know one is making news today, but he gave a no and a yes. The Wall Street Journal editorial board says in its new piece, quote, the U.S. failed to deter Mr. Putin by merely threatening sanctions, then imposed sanctions only gradually after the invasion. He resisted a ban on Russian oil imports, resisted trade restrictions, and has to be prodded to supply more arms. It's as if Mr. Biden is so wary of provoking Mr. Putin that he's afraid what might happen if Ukraine won the war. Senator Rubio, what's your take on all of it?
My take on it is that when you deal with someone like Vladimir Putin, there's a careful balancing act. On the one hand, it is true. I mean, there are things that responsible leaders have to do to avoid escalation. No one wants a nuclear exchange. No one wants him using tactical nuclear weapons. We don't want to inadvertently wind up into a major conflict between NATO and Russia. On the other hand, you have to understand that sometimes caution and sometimes those kinds of actions are an encouragement. It's basically encouraging someone like Putin to do more. And I think the president is getting that balance wrong. He has been led on many of these issues, has been dragged by members of his own party in Congress to position after position with regards to Ukraine. And frankly, I think that existed before the invasion, and it was a contributing factor to this happening. But now, really, our focus should be on doing everything we can to help Ukraine defeat Russia, whether it's a strategic defeat or an operational one. Putin needs to take an L here, and I believe he will. Certainly on the strategic front, he's going to take an L. And I think he might even take it on operationally, and it could ultimately lead to his downfall.
The line of the day. Marco Rubio said Putin needs to take an L on this one. Get out of the way. Senator, thank you so very much for being in focus. Great to see you.
Thank you.